2 Samuel 18 is the place you're going to want to be if you plan to be with us anyway, or with me, because that's where I'm going to be. So this is the fourth lesson of this study. David and Solomon, basically coming from 2 Samuel so far. And we've been the last 2 weeks looking at events surrounding David, as this book suggests. But more specifically, last week we started looking at one of his sons named Absalom, or really started looking at him 2 weeks ago. And unfortunate events, all leading back ultimately to what the prophet Nathan told David about his sin with Bathsheba, how the sword would never depart from his house as a punishment, the consequences of his sin. And whether or not he really understood what that meant exactly, or more specifically, he was starting to see it unfold with Amnon and Tamar, and then Absalom and Amnon. He killed him for what he did to Tamar. And now, last week we saw how Absalom sort of schemed his way back into the city, first of all, but then David wouldn't let him come into his presence, and then he schemed his way into getting back in David's presence. And now, he was going to scheme his way, or did scheme his way, we saw sort of at the very end last week, schemed his way into an attempt to steal the throne. So we get this idea that Absalom, he had a very personal problem with his dad. Because almost everything that he did was either in some way connected to something his dad did or didn't do, or was directly against his dad for different reasons. We speculated it may have been the negligence that he showed in punishing Amnon. Very well could have been a part of it, and I don't think there's any doubt it was definitely a part of it. But then, once he got back into the city, and he noticed some lackings on his dad's part, presumably anyway. You know what a good son would have done? If he actually wanted to repair the relationship between himself and his dad, if he actually respected his dad, then he would have tried to communicate this kind of thing to his dad. Like, maybe you ought to, I've noticed the people feel like they don't have a representative or something like that, and, you know, maybe you should be among the people more or something like that. Although we do get the impression generally that David seems to have been that kind of king as opposed to some kings. He was a man of the people for sure. But instead of doing that, Absalom saw the weakness in his dad's administration or his dad's rule, and he exploited that. He seized on that for himself, for the gain of his own gain instead of his father's gain. And that's what he was doing out in the court, the gate. He was stealing the hearts of Israel. And he did successfully do that. For 4 years, he was politicking and really buttering people up, sucking up, just saying all the right things. And then finally he said, I made a vow back when I was with Granddad. I forget the name of the place, Gesher. I made a vow to Jehovah, and I need to go pay that vow at Hebron. And David let him go. So what that plot was whenever you hear the trumpet, you people are to proclaim, Absalom is king at Hebron. Now, of all the things that Absalom had done so far that could be interpreted as treason, this was literal, the actual epitome of treason. He is telling these people, they've gone over to Hebron to supposedly pay this vow, and he says, whenever you get the signal, you declare, Absalom is king. The king. Not just the king of Hebron, he's the king of Israel at Hebron. And that was his plan, and that's what it was going to be. Well, in our lesson text, which is chapter 18, 2 Samuel 18, first 18 verses, we're going to see what unfolded as a result of this. Obviously, when you have a king in place who was not only appointed and loved by the people, he was actually anointed by Jehovah himself. And then you have this other king, or man, who's saying he's the king. They can't both go on like that. Talk about confusion, among other things. So they're going to have to settle this. And historically, there's only one way to settle this, and that's to have a battle. War. They're going to war. Basically, what we can see in Absalom is Absalom's doing everything that David refused to do when Saul was king. Everything that David said, I will not do it, Absalom is doing that. Only the difference is God hadn't chosen Absalom to be the next king, whereas he had chosen David. So David showed himself to be superior in character to Absalom every step of the way, not without his faults and imperfections, but still what Absalom is doing is what David would not do. So now they have to fight this out. Absalom is a threat to the nation, if for no other reason, because God has appointed David to be the king. So David must be the king, period. So now they're going to battle. Of course, David doesn't want to do this, but that's what's about to happen, and that's what we read as we get into chapter 18. The first 3 verses say this. It's going to vary a little bit depending on what translation you're using. I'll read from the ESV. It says, Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, his brother, Joab's brother that is, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. That's fun to say. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out. If we flee, they're not going to care about us, but if half of us die, they're not going to care. But you're worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it's better that you send us help from the city. You stay back. So to David's credit, he wanted to go. I've always admired, whether it's in history or in some work of fiction, kings who actually go out and fight. How much better for the men if the king's in front of them saying, let's go. And even when kings might go to battle, they're not necessarily going to be in the front lines. But still, even being with them would be a big help. And David, remember, he was no stranger to a battlefield. He was a mighty man. I mean, more or less. He may not be called that, but he was one, and he had a group of them. People you don't want to fight. You don't want to get on the battlefield against these guys. Yeah, Dean?
David was referred to as a warring king, and that's why God rejected him building the temple.
Yeah.
David wanted to build a temple, but because he was known as a warring king, that God wanted Solomon to build a temple instead, and that's what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, David was a man of war, and, most of that, or at least a lot of that, was of no fault of his own, especially this. This was all, he didn't want this. Absalom brought this, but yet David was very experienced in war, and now he's king, and we get the impression, that he kind of feels more, he may feel more at home as a soldier than as a king. And as a king, he was accustomed, usually, to go out to battle. And that's one of the significances of chapter 12, or is it chapter 11? Chapter 11 begins, that's the chapter of the sin with Bathsheba. It begins by describing an occasion when the kings go out to battle that he didn't go. And he got himself in a lot of trouble for not going. Well, now he wants to go, but the men said, no, you're not coming. You're worth more than 10,000 of us. Which, strictly speaking, it is true. That is a true statement. That the king, it's unfortunate when the king thinks of it this way, that I'm worth more than 10,000 of you, so there's no way I'm going out there. That just sounds like an excuse when it comes from the king. But when the king says, I'm going out, and the men say, no, you're not, because 10,000 of us could die, and it could still be won. If you die, it's over. If you go out, every single man has one target, and that's all. It's you. And as soon as you're dead, the whole thing is over. So they convinced him to stay back. What I said about the variation in translation in 2 Samuel 18:1 is that some versions say he numbered the people, the men. And that is sort of a buzzword that implies wrongdoing, isn't it? Because David would later get in trouble for doing something called numbering the men, because God took that as a sign that he did not properly trust and have faith in God, and that's why he was counting the men. I want to make sure I know how many men we have so I can decide what kind of chance we have of winning this battle. God's anger was kindled by that. But in 18:1, the word used there is not the same word as the word used in chapter 24, which is where that happened. That word in chapter 24 means number or count. This word means he assembled them, he organized them, which is what it's described in the rest of the verse. The ESV translates that word, he mustered them, which is sort of like he gathered them together to organize them. So he wasn't doing the thing that he did in chapter 24 that made God angry. He was just organizing the men that he had, setting 1/3 of them under Joab, 1/3 of them under his brother Abishai, Joab's brother Abishai, and 1/3 under this man named Ittai the Gittite. So, David's convinced he's not going to go into battle. Whatever seems best to you, I will do. That shows the character of David right there as a king. How many times can you imagine hearing a king say those words? Whatever seems best to you, I will do. That's the exact opposite of a king. That's the whole benefit of being a king, right? Whatever seems best to me is what I'm going to do, and whatever seems best to me is what you're going to do. That's a king that we would think of. David was not like that at all. I got a feeling Saul would have been like that, but David was not like that. Whatever seems best to you, I will do. No wonder he was so beloved by the people and such a great king and remembered that way as a man after God's own heart. However, he did have one command to give. Only one. And this is the most important part of this chapter. The king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard it when he said it. That we talk about, I mentioned foreshadowing a couple weeks ago in our Wednesday night study. This is essentially a kind of foreshadowing. This is going to come back. And I'll tell you another thing of foreshadowing that we talked about last week is Absalom's beautiful Fabio hair. Okay? Remember Carl made us all think about Fabio when we talked about Absalom's good looks, and he had tons of hair. Well, that's going to come back too in this section. So David says, whatever seems best to you, I'll do. I'll stay back. But my only request and command is don't. He says deal gently with him, but what he means is don't kill him. It seems, anyway. At least that's how the statement's going to be was interpreted by the men, or at least one of the men, was deal gently with him, that is, spare him. So file that in the back of your mind. That was the one thing that the king if not the only thing, the number one thing. Deal gently with Absalom. And everybody heard it. So, next was the battle. Verses 6 through 8 says, basically the army went out and fought, as expected. Fought in the field of the forest of Ephraim. We don't know exactly where that is, but they did, and I guess that's all that matters. The men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. Isn't that interesting words? The men of Israel were defeated by David and his servants. You know what that implies? Seems to imply? Absalom, it was an understatement when it said Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He apparently stole a lot of them. He won maybe the majority of them over to his cause. Because the writer here describes it, the men who lost were not Absalom's men, they were the men of Israel. So it almost sounds like he had the bigger force, at least as far as the men of, calling them the men of Israel. 20,000 men died that day. A horrible day by any account. The battle spread over the face of all the country. So the battle has been fought and the battle has been won. Just no big, huge battle scene, just 3 verses. They went out to battle, verse 6. They fought in the battle, verse 6. And David won the battle in verse 7. But then verse 9 is where it really picks back up. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David too, personally, directly, face to face. Not just Absalom's men that he sent in, but Absalom himself. Now he is there on his mule, facing them. And he's running away now. He's retreating as fast as that mule will take him. Here's what it says. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. You can picture that, can't you? It sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? If you picture that, what's just been described, it looks kind of funny. Somebody riding, almost like getting clotheslined by something when you're riding on a horse or something, but except in his case, that beautiful Fabio Pantene hair got stuck in these branches, thick branches.
He should have done his annual cut.
Yeah, apparently he may have been overdue for his shearing. Mm-hmm.
Is this the only civil war that Israel has? I mean, these were Israelites fighting Israelites instead of fighting other countries. I just found it when it was saying that the battle or what happened covered the face of the country. Everyone would have been affected by the death of someone in that battle.
Mm-hmm.
Of God's people. Is that the case? Is this it's a civil war.
Yeah.
It's the only one that comes to mind.
In the United period, I guess maybe. Of course, later, once they divided, they were, I don't know if we'd call it a war necessarily, but it was almost just a constant, or at least off and on, atmosphere of hostility to each other. It's kind of like the way it is over there now. It's not like a one single war like World War II that you can, say started here, ended here, or our Civil War started here, ended here, World War I, but just throughout all these years, decades and decades, constant hostility towards each other, these different groups. That happened later on, but this was at least the first time that Israelite was against Israelite in this way. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Two, see, I think here, especially with Absalom on that mule, God's promise was taking place here because of the fact it says the mule went under the tree. Okay, like I said, Absalom didn't
Yeah.
been hanging. So it seemed like, it seemed like it was God's hand, and then because we know that David prophesied that there was going to be a sword in David's house, and this was part of it. Even though David did not want Absalom to be harmed, God had other plans. God saw fit that he was going to take Absalom's life.
Yeah. Maybe God had, he very well could have given that mule a little help.
This thing's kind of funny, like I say,
But that
he
is
could have went around the tree, or not unless he was trying to hide. I don't know.
Yeah. We,
Trying to hide.
the details are so scarce that we don't really know exactly how this played out. Was he so stuck that he was literally just hanging there without his feet touching the ground the whole time? Or did he just get caught in the tree and then, he was so stuck that he just couldn't get himself worked out, away from it, so that David's men caught him because of that? Maybe he just delayed him enough for them to catch him? Or was he, did he initially get stuck in the tree by his hair, but then was sort of up in the tree trying to get his hair out or whatever? We don't know every detail. What we do know is that what's recorded is that he did not intend to get hampered by that oak tree, but he did. And then we read in verse 10, a certain man saw it and went and told Joab. Now, I love this man. He's my favorite character of chapter 18, of this section at least. I guess maybe besides David. But this man, this is a loyal man, a faithful man, a righteous man as far as that goes. He saw Absalom and told Joab. We have no clue who this man is. All we know is that he wasn't Joab, he wasn't Abishai, and he wasn't Ittai, because he mentions them separately from himself. He tells Joab what he saw. Absalom stuck in that oak tree. He uses the word hanging in that oak tree, which may speak to the concept we just mentioned, that he was actually stuck hanging there. Joab said to the man who told him, he didn't like this at all. He said, "What? You saw him? That's it? You saw him? Why didn't you kill him? Right there. I would have been more than happy to give you a reward. 10 pieces of silver, and I'll even give you a new belt." Joab is the opposite of this man. He is slick. He's a snake. He's kind of like Absalom. Maybe that's why they had a connection or relation to each other in some way. They were cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Joab clearly has a personal vendetta against Absalom. I would have been glad to give you a reward. So David gave one command. Joab seemed to, all along, if he didn't say so, he at least was willing, admits that he had been willing to, under the table, so to speak, reward anybody who kills that young punk in his mind. Yeah, Dean?
I think like this, it says, a certain young man, he was like David. Because David had the opportunity when Saul was king to take his life. But he said he would not take the life of the
Yeah.
anointed. And I think this is the same way this man here was feeling, the fact that this was the son of the King David, and David said not to.
Mm-hmm.
So he had that much respect of his God.
Yeah.
That he did not do.
And he at least tried to get Joab to think for a second. Even though
Yeah, he told Joab, strikes me as the kind of man that most people would not say anything back to, in any way, whether it's, in a sarcastic or ugly way or just in an honest and sincere way, because Joab seems to be the kind of guy that, you just don't mess with, even if you're not meaning to mess with him. He's got a short fuse maybe. But I want to point out, clearly Joab is not thinking like this against Absalom because he loves David so much. How dare he do this to my king, David? He's going to pay for his insolence against the king. This is personal between Joab and Absalom. Remember, one of the things that Absalom did to get Joab's attention, because he wouldn't answer his calls, he burned his fields. So I don't think it took Joab very long to realize maybe it wasn't the best idea for me to bring him back to Jerusalem. But now it's personal, and he seems to have had it in his heart all along. I'm gonna get this guy. I won't stop until he's dead. But he says, why didn't you kill him? Well, the answer to that's obvious. And the man said in verse 12, he responded, even if I had felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver. Almost sounds like it implies that he doesn't believe Joab, that Joab would have paid him a penny. He said, I don't care if I actually felt 1,000 pieces of silver in my hands. I wouldn't reach out my hand against the king's son. And not just because he's the king, and not just because he's the king's son, but because in our hearing, he says, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai to protect him. That took a lot of courage. But you know what? That didn't take as much courage as the next thing he says. He says, besides, I know that if I had dealt treacherously against his life, you would have stood aloof. You wouldn't have helped me. You wouldn't have had my back. You would have been like, I don't know anything about this. I didn't tell him to do that. He went on his own. That took, if the first thing he said was true and he needed to hear that, but this thing is like, almost like a little slap. He knows Joab, and he lets Joab know that he knows Joab. Who are you kidding, Joab? You wouldn't have paid me anything, and you wouldn't have defended me before the king. But I just love how he says, in our hearing, the king commanded you. He's reminding him of what the king told him. And notice how he refers to killing Absalom, dealing treacherously. To hurt Absalom would be to deal treacherously. That should have been another wake-up call. You need to be careful, Joab. What you're suggesting here is treason. Because every single man of us heard him tell you not to hurt him, but to protect him. And part of protecting him would be to make sure none of us kill him. And yet here you stand telling me that I should have killed him. Well, for this man's sake, thankfully, Joab had more pressing concerns than punishing that man or taking it out on him. He said, I'm not going to waste my time with you. But instead, he immediately went. He took 3 javelins. He went to that oak tree, and he thrust them right into Absalom. Just right then. Took them. He said, I'm done with you. This is stupid. I'm going. I'll do it myself. But still, Absalom wasn't dead, because he apparently had his armor bearers, 10 of them. I don't know why in the world one man would need 10 armor bearers, but he had them. Maybe they took turns. He took all 10 of them, apparently. And they're not going to act without his command. So the fact they did it implies that he commanded them. He wanted them to do this. They surrounded him and killed him, struck him until he was dead. So he wanted the pleasure of feeling his own javelin thrust into Absalom. But then maybe even a cowardly move. He didn't kill him. He had his armor bearers kill him. But I didn't kill him. They killed him. I'm not suggesting he did that, but I guess the kind of man he was, I wouldn't put it past him to do something like that. The thing is, he totally disregarded what David told him to do. Could not have cared less about David, what David wanted.
And he's just assuming, David's going to find out that he did that.
Yeah, well, that's another thing the man threw in there to him, is nothing's hidden from the king. Everybody heard him tell you not to protect Absalom. If you go and kill him, everybody's going to know that you disobeyed the king, because everybody heard him tell you to protect him. But he did it anyway. Again.
Why did that guy not, the one that went to him, why did he not go help him to get him out of that situation, still leaving him hang there?
I guess because, you mean before he talked to Joab or after? I'm assuming this man did the right thing in that he went to his immediate superior, commanding officer.
But he knew the king did not want anything to happen to him, and leaving him hang there, he was vulnerable because he couldn't defend himself.
Yeah. Well, it's because the king had commanded everybody, or in everybody's hearing, not to hurt him. So he found him, and then he went to tell Joab, assuming that Joab would do the right thing, because everybody heard the king tell him directly, protect him. So he goes to him. He wasn't going to do anything to Absalom, good or bad. He's just going to go to the the ranking officer and tell him, who would then come and, it was his prerogative to either get Absalom down from there, or to wait and get David, or whatever it may have been. He was just reporting it to the ranking officer there, who then revealed to him that he was no good, which I think he already knew in a lot of ways that he was no good, but he probably at least didn't expect him to be this outright, with his disobedience and rebellion against David. Maybe I should have told Abishai, but maybe obviously he seems to have been a man that was under Joab. Remember, 1/3 was under Joab, 1/3 was under Abishai, 1/3 was under the other guy. So he told his superior and warned him to be careful, basically, in so many words, and called him out for his saying, I would have given you money, I would have paid, I would have rewarded you. No, you wouldn't. You would have left me hanging there, and you would have been pleased that Absalom was dead for your own revenge, but then you would have been totally fine with me getting killed for it, being executed for doing it. So Joab blew the trumpet, which meant the battle's over, we've won, and that was that. They took Absalom, they threw him in a great pit in the forest, raised over him a very great heap of stones. Everybody fled to his own home. Now, in hindsight, or retrospect, it says that during his lifetime, Absalom had set up a pillar for himself, like all humble men do, right? Because he said, I don't have a son to keep my name in remembrance. So I'll set this pillar up to be my remembrance forever. And ironically, he even called it after his own name. I don't know how exactly, the pillar of Absalom, I don't know. Absalom's pillar. Maybe he just called it Absalom. But the irony is that even to the day of this book being written, that monument was still there in Absalom's remembrance. However, now his legacy was totally different than what it could have been. He could have been remembered in a totally different way. Now he's remembered as all this nasty stuff he did behind his father's back, treachery to the king, treason, tried to usurp the throne of his father, rebellion against God himself, murdering his brother. All that has been recorded and preserved for all these centuries in remembrance of Absalom. That's the remembrance that we have of Absalom. Well, what in the world possible applications could we get from this account? Buzz your head before you go to battle. Maybe that could be one. It's not the best application, but hindsight's 20/20.
Ideally, the people in high authority positions that Joab was in would have better morals.
Yeah, be careful who you appoint to ranking positions. That is one of the, arguably the reason why elders in the church and even deacons have certain pre-qualifications, almost all of which are spiritual, moral, if you will, because you need to be careful who is in a position of authority. Well, just imagine how this would have gone if this certain man had been the commander instead of Joab. Now, if Joab was the one that found Absalom, the same thing would have. He would have killed him. But if some other man found Absalom and then came and told this man, "Hey, we found Absalom," Absalom would have, the king's command would have been obeyed. But it was Joab, and this isn't the last time Joab causes problems either, until he eventually is. He just seems to keep getting bolder and bolder to the point where he's going to rebuke the king himself. And I'll give him an ounce of credit. He almost has a point in chapter 19, which I guess we'll see that if we come to that in our lessons. But he rebukes David. He disobeys David, etc. Yeah, Dean.
Actually, he was going against God's anointing. And whenever you go against God's anointing, you know it. It's just like David, he wasn't going to go against God's anointing. Because, if he did, I was going to do that.
Yeah.
And after he went against God's anointing, because he was anointed by God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, sometimes in life we have to do unpleasant things, don't we? And that's not to say, we have to do sinful things, because nobody has to do sinful things. There's always a choice not to sin. But things that we may not enjoy, like, for instance, having to confront a brother or sister because of their sin, that should never be pleasant, should it? If it's pleasant, we don't need to be the one doing it. Somebody else should do it if we find that pleasant. But when those times come, we need to make preparations. Like David, he didn't want to have to go to battle. But in his circumstances, in his situation, which has no application to us, literally, he was going to have to, but he made necessary preparations. For us, in a spiritual way, the preparations begin with living in a godly way. Always the best number one on the list. I need to get my own life right. I need to live in a godly way. And then make sure my motives are pure. Because I could do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And while the result may be accomplished all the same, as far as if I'm confronting a brother with sin, it'll be all the more effective if I'm pure in my motives and in my conduct. So that's a lesson we can learn from David in this. But here's probably the most powerful lesson to take from this, from Joab. No good can come when people reject God's plan and engage in selfish and sinful behavior. Absolutely no good. So just think about how Joab utterly and completely ignored his king's command to spare Absalom. He did not. It's like he didn't even hear it. He never mentions it. He even when he's directly told about it, he doesn't acknowledge it. He just says, "Why didn't you kill Absalom when you saw him?" As if he had, he's just pretending like that never happened. And even when the man told him, "Don't you remember? We all heard him tell you." "I'm not wasting my time with you." Goes and kills him. Utterly disregarded. Well, there are many, many people who pull a Joab every day. But instead of disregarding the king of the land, they're disregarding the king of the universe. God has commanded us. God has revealed His will to us. And many, many people just pretend like it never happened. Pretend like God doesn't exist. Pretend like God doesn't care what we do. Or pretend like, He cares about if we kill people and stuff like that, but He doesn't really care about if I do this or that or this other thing. God has spoken, and when God has spoken, we must listen and take it to heart. The Proverbs writer said, good sense wins favor, but the way of the treacherous is their ruin. Joab, first of all, David learned that lesson in his life. Joab, hopefully will learn that lesson before it's too late. Maybe a long shot, but there's hope for everybody, I guess. No hope for Absalom, though. You know why? Because Joab killed him. He could have made it right. Again, may have been a long shot, but Absalom could have repented. And maybe David wanted to give him that chance, which is why even in his position, he wanted to spare the man who killed his firstborn son. Sure, he was also his son, but he still killed his firstborn son, murdered him. But his way would have given him the chance to repent, but Joab robbed him of that.